Great.
Yeah.
And
I'm like, okay, I can like go with you if you want to yeah, because I usually have my camera on too.
How do we know that they can see it?
actually, so I need to share screen and then run it from there, right?
Like it keeps your photo there. I don't have to write it. And it's super distracting.
So he just started the presentation.
Yeah. Like me next to it. It's like no matter how you.
Let's start. There we go.
Brian is not sharing the screen.
Did someone say that?
Looks like, no, it looks like,
Yeah.
okay.
Natasha says she can see
Yeah.
it.
I put it in something.
Okay, that's weird.
Um,
Well,
yeah, she was in the car.
I'm not. I
thank
don't
you all
care.
for coming here today. It's a pleasure to have Professor Bryan McCormick here from Department of Health and Rehabilitation Sciences. And Dr. McCormick will be sharing with us some of his theorizing and research ideas about the importance of social connectedness and social embeddedness for the health and well-being, which is true of everybody, but particularly for people with serious mental illnesses. And what's particularly interesting about this work is he's trying to understand at a deeper level, what is it about social connections that are health promoting? And one of the factors that he's looking at is mattering to others. So how being embedded and connected in social relationships, meaningful social relationships, can create a sense of mattering, which can have some psychological and potentially some physical health benefits as well. And since we're running a little late, I'll just turn it right over.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Steve. I really appreciate being invited to come and talk about this. I know that there are a number of people viewing online, and I appreciate the folks joining online. I had a brief conversation with Christina earlier this week in which Christina had said there aren't going to be a whole lot of people there. I said, I have been talking to a computer for 2 years, and I really would like to talk to people for a change. And so I appreciate those of you who've come in person and also those online. Let me begin. Come on. Okay. Let me begin. The work is in part funded by a grant from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehab Research. We were funded on a project called Being Needed, and this is really the essence of what I'm going to talk about today. The contents of the presentation, because it is federally funded, but also the work of independent investigators, does not necessarily represent the policy of NIDLR or Health and Human Services. So this is a quote from Kurt Vonnegut, one of my favorite authors. The worst thing that could happen to anybody is to never be used by anyone for anything. Thank you for using me, even though I didn't want to be used by anybody. This, to me, when I first read this is a book called Sirens of Titan. It was written, I think, in 1959 or 1960. But it really talks about this idea of how being connected to others and being needed by others, in other words, what Vonnegut calls being used by others, is actually quite important to our being human. That if nobody needs us, if nobody uses us, it says something about where we stand in our social networks and in our social world. And it's not particularly a good thing. So let me tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from. First, I am trained as a recreational therapist and worked in an inpatient rehabilitation setting with substance abuse and mental health conditions for adults and adolescents. Having said that, I have to actually give a little bit of a shout out to a group of recreation therapy seniors who are watching as a group over in 1700 North Broad this afternoon. I worked there, and while I was older, when I came out of college, a lot of times I was working with people who said, you don't understand, you don't understand, you don't understand. This is particularly with the adults with substance abuse disorders. You didn't live my life, you don't understand. And I'd not lived that life, but I certainly knew it. You know, many of us have family histories that connect us to substance abuse and mental health conditions, so it wasn't unknown. But what that really led me to do was, in my master's work, to spend 9 months attending Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. I went to meetings, I hung out afterwards in meetings, I went to coffee with people, I went to dances. I spent 9 months hanging out in the social world of Alcoholics Anonymous in order to understand, in order to know what they were talking about. And it was a really interesting experience for me to look at how people could talk about this concept of sobriety in multiple different levels. It's also not drinking, but it's a way of living. It's very close to this concept of recovery and mental health, that it isn't necessarily cured, it's a way of living. And so that really led me to start to think about how people make sense of chaos, because most of these stories that they told were stories of loss, stories of chaos. And so what I saw in this was people figured out ways to make sense of the stuff that couldn't be made sense of. I moved on to do a doctoral dissertation, and these two look like completely different studies, right? One's in AA and one's in older residents in retirement villages. But I happened to be working with somebody who had a strength in gerontology in my graduate program, and I went to Clemson and did this dissertation looking at two groups of older adults living in essentially the same community. Some had aged in place in rural South Carolina, others had moved in from basically the Great Lakes region to retire there. And what I saw was these two worlds that were very different. The ones that had aged in place had only a sense of community from history. All of the institutions that used to bring them together, schools, farming, shops, all of these things had left the small towns and gone to the larger urban centers. Whereas the people who came in from the Midwest tended to make their own communities around golf people, around lake people, around tennis people. And so they created this sense of community through shared experience. And so really one of the things that connected one to the other was when I was first doing my dissertation work, I thought, where are the people? I can't find people. I can't get people. Like in AA, it was really easy. I just went to the meetings. There were the people. And so I came to start to ask a question, what brings people together around here? And in many of the rural village residents, they would say there's not much. Well, it used to be schools. Well, we used to all go to the same church. Well, we used to have these stores where everybody bought stuff. And so I started to think about, it isn't just about coming together. People have to have a way to connect. They have to have a place to connect. And then subsequent to that, I've had 3 different academic positions, first at East Carolina and Greenville, North Carolina. I was at Indiana University in Southern Indiana for 22 years, and I've been at Temple now for 5 years. And really came to Temple to work with some colleagues in the Temple University Collaborative on Community Inclusion. But how did this shape my thinking? First of all, I do think that people make sense of the world socially. And social support is a part of this process, and particularly not the instrumental type of support. Instrumental support means those things that we need a ride, or we need somebody to lend us money, somebody to help us move. Those are considered instrumental acts. And so when we make sense of the world, social support is very important, or the way that other people interact with us and help us to sustain our view of the world. It's also very interesting that mutual sense-making creates bonds. So the title here is a paper I never wrote, but I threatened to write for the last 25 years. And it's called You Had to Be There. So one of the challenges in making sense of the world is that we make sense socially, but it also connects us to those people who experienced that with us. In other words, there's something about making sense of the world that is so powerful that words alone can't really convey the experience. I happen to also do a study abroad program. I tell the students before we go, you will never be able to explain this to somebody back home. You won't. You can use all the words you want. They'll never understand what you're talking about. And so nobody believes me, of course. They don't think that that's possible. But when we come back, it is the experience of everybody. They can talk to each other about it in ways that are much more complex, much more deep, and share a much stronger social bond than trying to explain it to somebody who wasn't there. And so it really becomes this idea of how do we make sense of the world, and why does that bond us socially? And then finally, because of the early work, and I was really looking at social support, what I came to realize is that almost all of the research on social support asks you, who can you turn to for a ride if you need one? Who can you turn to talk about difficult problems? Who can you turn to when you're feeling down? But the problem is, it never asks who turns to you. And this is really, to me, one of the biggest challenges. I didn't touch anything. This is really one of the biggest challenges, I think, in terms of the way we've looked at social support research, is that we've only looked at the person's resources available to them, but never really looked at who turns to you. Because if nobody comes to you for assistance or aid, again, it says something about your social standing and your social network, and it's not a good thing. So as Steve has mentioned, the work that I do and have done for most of my professional career focuses on adults with serious mental illness. The National Institutes of Mental Health defines serious mental illness as a mental behavioral emotional disorder resulting from serious functional impairment substantially interferes with one or more major life activities. So these are typically mental disorders that are long lasting, that impact people's abilities to engage in aspects and components of life. And it affects about 14.2 million adults in the United States, estimated in 2020. The most common categories, although these are not exclusive, but the most common categories that comprise, definitional categories that comprise serious mental illness are schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression. These are long-lasting disorders. They are also episodic. Most of these disorders are not like diabetes. Diabetes is a chronic disease. Once you have it, you have it. These have episodes. People function well, and then they may have times of difficulty. And so this is one of the things about serious mental illness that interrupts people's life situations in significant ways. But it also puts them at significant health disparity. The estimate is that people with serious mental illness die 10 to 25 years earlier than adults without serious mental illness. Now, a lot of people will think that that's because some of the things associated with serious mental illness involve particularly suicide. But even if you account for suicide, the early mortality is significantly higher. For example, brain cancer reduces your life expectancy by about 12 years, schizophrenia by about 25. And it isn't the disorder itself. It's the health disparities that people tend to find themselves in. When you look at the rate of obesity and overweight, almost 75% of people, and this was in a national study using biomarkers, were either obese or overweight. Half of them were obese. Some of the challenges that people run into is that many of the medications that are used to treat these illnesses generate significant weight gain, as much as 2 kilos a month. That's 4.4 pounds a month. Over a year, that's a significant weight gain. The other thing that we see is that people are incredibly sedentary. We did a study with using accelerometers, which measure movement. There was a program that automatically determined if somebody was using it or not. If they had 0 counts for 20 minutes, they were considered to be non-compliant. Well, we realized that the people we were working with could sit motionless for half an hour. They weren't non-compliant. They were just that sedentary, that motionless. And so in this study with Gretchen Sneven, who's also a faculty member and colleague, we looked at this and we found that 6 hours a day were spent in sedentary behavior. That's basically what you folks are doing now. You're in sedentary behavior. You're sitting, you're not moving. And so this is a big part of it. In addition, only about 38 minutes a day were engaged in vigorous or moderate physical activity, significantly lower than is necessary for health benefit. And so we see this incredible inactivity and sedentary behavior. The obesity, the inactivity, and leads to a lot of cardiovascular, cardiometabolic syndromes. Metabolic syndrome is a precursor to diabetes. It's 52% of adults with serious mental illness were identified as having metabolic syndrome. So again, you see this really significant high health risk. Half of people with serious mental illness identified as having hypertension. So all of these point to the health risks associated with this diagnosis. And it isn't the diagnosis, it's the life situation that people fall into that has much more to do with the ill health outcomes of serious mental illness. Social isolation and loneliness are two of the ones that are widely recognized as health threats to adults with serious mental illness. So what do we know about people with serious mental illness and their network? So for example, they have a very reduced social network. In fact, in one study, the median number of people identified in their social network was 4. That means 50% of the group could identify 4 or fewer people. And in fact, 45% identified 3 or fewer people in their network. We were working on a grant project with a colleague. She had been working with a group in Chicago, and they were doing follow-up studies. And she was remarked on how many adults they were working with who couldn't identify another person who could follow up with them a year from now. They couldn't put in a contact that might still know them a year from now. And so this idea of incredibly small networks is really, one of the characteristic challenges. There's a significant decline in community participation on the onset of a serious mental illness. Oftentimes these develop over a period of years. Onset is typically late adolescence, early adulthood. Diagnosis, really, the people have some challenges usually prior to diagnosis. But there is this decline and reduction in engagement in the community, something that we're really interested in. Network churn means the number of people in their network turns over. So for example, a lot of times people with serious mental illness experience a lot of life transitions. This could be incarceration, this could be loss of a job, this could be divorce, this could be relocation. All of these things happen at a much higher rate for adults with serious mental illness. And as a result, there's a lot of network churn. There's a lot of people that get turned over. And so what we find is really high rates of loneliness. And I'll show you how high a little bit later on. So what is the importance of social connections? Well, first of all, it's identified as a basic human need, basic at the level of it is a basic sensory pleasure akin to food. So in other words, the amount of pleasure we get just from eye gaze and touch and those sorts of things, those are major reinforcers. They don't require translation in the cortex, right? They are a basic pleasure. So we change our behavior, we physiologically react to human contact. Not surprisingly, it is a significantly important factor in human happiness. The absence of social connection undermines well-being, undermines happiness, and as a result, it undermines our access to pleasurable experience. One of the things that's really interesting, and this was one of the things that I pulled out early on in the pandemic, we were doing some work on how to remain connected while staying apart. Because basically what was happening at the beginning of the pandemic, we had a real challenge with that because people were talking about social distancing. And we said, physical distancing, not social distancing. We're working with people who are already socially isolated and disconnected. Saying don't connect with other people was really the wrong message. And so what we really looked at was, how do you stay connected while remaining physically distant? But it's really interesting that a lot of the little things we do on our everyday basis, I ride the train. I always say thanks to the conductor when I get off the train in the morning. Don't always get a response, but I say thanks. I open the door for people. You just do little things like this. And the inability or the disconnection from these types of like little gestures really start to undermine this idea of mutual trust and shared purpose. And so a lot of this around social connection, a lot of these little tiny things really do play a role in the way we feel connected to others, and it contributes to our well-being. And then finally, this area of collective efficacy. If you're familiar with Albert Bandera's work, a lot of his work is on self-efficacy, but he also identifies this idea of collective efficacy, is that through a group, through social connections, we actually can achieve more than any one individual can. And so there's a sense of power in this. We're working on an intervention right now to try and build collective efficacy through engaging people around shared interests and start to be able to overcome barriers. Self-help groups are essentially built on this concept, right? But together we can overcome these barriers much more effectively than any one individual can alone. So one of the biggest challenges in this area is the lack of clarity in terms of what we're talking about. So this citation at the beginning here by Cacioppo really shows one of the challenges in this area. We review selected evidence on the nature of social relationships and focus on the extent to which an individual feels isolated, i.e. feels lonely in a social world. Now realize that Cacioppo has been studying loneliness for decades. But the idea that they conflate isolation and loneliness is really somewhat problematic. Many people have tried to distinguish these in a couple of lines, and these are the lines that most of what we work on is based on this. Social isolation is an absence of social connection. It is an objective measure, right? So how many people are in your social network? How many people do you talk to on a regular basis? Do you live alone? Now, marital status is an indicator oftentimes used. It actually should be partnership status, more so than marital status, because the benefits of official marriage is there is a benefit to it, but there's a lot of benefit to simply having a partner, an important discussion partner. And so this idea of isolation means that people can be different levels within social isolation. And this is also something that's important to know too, because some people are just fine with a small social network and few contacts. That's just fine with them. And other people need a lot more people in their world to connect them. The other thing too that's interesting about social isolation is that it's not a truly linear sort of benefit, right? You think about having no one in your social world. Well, if you have one, that's a pretty good improvement. But it starts to level off, right? Is the difference between 0 and 1 the same as the difference between 20 and 21? Probably not. So social isolation in this objective measure is one way of looking at it. It's been looked at pretty extensively. Loneliness, though, represents this inadequacy of social connections. The connections we have. So I can be fairly socially connected and still be lonely, right? That I may have a lot of relationships, but none of them are particularly satisfying. They're just people I know or people that are my family members or whatever. And so initially, the conceptualization really talked about social versus emotional loneliness, and we're looking at this somewhat. But the social loneliness really is more connected to this idea of isolation. It's the social network and the absence of an acceptable social network and contact. But emotional loneliness really is the absence of a connection, an important connection to others. And so this idea, one of the questions I actually asked about discussion partners, like, who do you talk to for important matters? Is there someone you always go to? And so oftentimes it really is identified as this difference between what I wish it was like and what it actually is like. And that's how we examine loneliness. So when we talk about social isolation now, and this is one of the interesting measures too, and they don't actually map completely the same. Absence of social connection, social isolation shows an increased all-cause mortality. And this reference by House, 1988. It may seem like really, really long time ago, but this was actually one of the most important works that followed people prospectively. And what it found was, regardless of your original health status. So in other words, if you were sick and you were better socially connected, and someone else was sick and they were less socially connected, their mortality rate was much higher than yours. And so it really identified that social connection and all-cause mortality was related, even controlling for original health status. And a lot of the things that they've been looking at in terms of social isolation is a lot of things like increased cardiovascular risk, increased oxidative stress and inflammation, which leads to potential cancers, hypertension, cardiovascular disease. So the evidence for social isolation as a killer is in fact very strong. And so one of the things too that we think about in terms of social isolation and how this can result in negative outcomes is a study that I saw a long time ago, a number of years ago, and it looked at adults with serious mental illness. And it looked at how they entered the mental health system. Did they enter the mental health system through the mental health system, or did they enter the mental health system through the judicial system? In other words, they were brought in by the police. Not a good outcome. Living alone significantly predicted judicial interference. So in other words, if you're living alone and you have a severe mental illness, there's nobody there to see you starting to get sick. There's nobody there to help you to get into the system. The police are going to come at some point. And so this is how social isolation can be a risk factor in health outcomes, right? That when people are alone, nobody is there to notice if something's not going well, to prompt them to take better help. There was a study, actually an article, conceptual piece in 2013, American Journal of Public Health, said social isolation is a mortality predictor comparable to other risk factors. In other words, social isolation has as much an adverse impact on your health as smoking, and it has as much of an adverse impact on your health as hypertension. So it is recognized as a significant issue in public health, is social isolation and loneliness. So when we start to look at loneliness and outcomes, negative outcomes in terms of loneliness, again, we see many of the same things. One of the things we do see is cognitive decline. And this is really compounding. A lot of this has been looked at among older adults, right? So we're dealing with older adults whose cognitive faculties may be somewhat compromised simply from age, but at the same time, people who may also be experiencing greater and greater loneliness because of a loss of social connections. And so in all populations, we do see that loneliness is associated with cognitive decline. It interferes with people's cognition. One of the things, and I actually don't even have it up, is it also tends to create a situation of vigilance. Lonely people tend to look for negative social information and interactions, and they become hypervigilant about it. And it makes it more difficult for them to interact in public. It has a somewhat of a social anxiety multiplier effect. Not surprisingly, it's highly associated with depressive symptoms, cardiovascular disease, including stroke and hypertension. Not surprisingly, again, self-harm. We see increased hospitalizations among adults with serious mental illness and poor disease self-management. So loneliness itself has a number of concerning outcomes. So here's what we looked at. We were trying to figure out, okay, well, what is loneliness among adults with serious mental illness? So in this diagram, the bottom is adults without serious mental illness. The bottom histogram are adults without serious mental illness, because we were thinking, well, do we just say like a standard deviation above the mean for adults with serious mental illness, and that's lonely, right? But we had this direct comparison and said, no, actually, why don't we look at adults without serious mental illness and figure out where that is? And so this one you're looking at on the bottom histogram, it is the 75th percentile of adults without serious mental illness. That's where that line is on the bottom. Now transfer that up to the upper histogram. That's adults with serious mental illness. Something like 2/3 of adults with serious mental illness are above the 75th percentile of adults without serious mental illness. This really speaks to some of the challenges, because it's a huge issue within adults with serious mental illness. And it also doesn't seem to follow the same patterns. Among adults without serious mental illness, loneliness is highest at young adulthood and later adulthood. And it tends to follow a U-shape. Among adults with serious mental illness, age is invariant. Loneliness is pretty constant across all age groups. And so this really spoke to the need that this is a significant issue within adults with serious mental illness with potential negative outcomes for us. So what do we know about social connections among adults with serious mental illness? First of all, as I mentioned, they have smaller networks than other people. When we look at the composition of those social networks, a higher proportion of family, particularly for adults, there's a fairly common transition among social networks where young people have a lot of family in their social networks, and then through late adolescence and early adulthood, some of those relationships are replaced by friends and coworkers and others. But what we see with adults with serious mental illness is that transition, that replacement oftentimes doesn't occur. They do have fewer percentage of friends, although they do have friends. They tend to have more professionals in their social networks. That's not common in other adults. We don't typically have professionals in our social networks. Some people may if they work with a regular therapist or something like that, but it's not a common thing. And then the other thing is that a lot of the people in their networks who are friends might be other service users. And there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, those friends can provide great support. The challenge that I oftentimes point to is though those networks are fragile. When networks are small, if one person isn't available, you might have lost a quarter of your support. If your supporters are other community mental health users, of people dealing with mental health conditions themselves, they may not be doing well right now, and they may not be available to you. And so the issue is really this fragility of their social networks. It's not that they're necessarily poor or impoverished, it's just that they're fragile. And then high rates of loneliness, as I mentioned, and then what is conveyed through social connections. To what extent do the social connections we have involve role reversal? One of the most interesting, and this is a side note, but one of the most interesting studies I ever worked with a doctoral student to do is with children with autism. We use Dance Dance Revolution. You guys familiar with DDR? Okay. We used DDR, brought kids with autism into the lab and taught them it to proficiency. And then brought in a self-identified peer without autism from that child's classroom. And now the child with autism was the teacher and the child without autism was the learner. We intentionally reversed the social roles because a lot of times the only relationships children with autism had were as an inferior role. They were always not as good as. And this is key also with people with serious mental illness. Many of the roles they're in are subordinate roles. They are only the recipient of help. They are rarely the giver of help. Again, says something about people's situation in life. So this comes to this question of mattering. Mattering first was identified as an element of self-concept. For some of you, you might recognize the name Rosenberg's self-esteem score. It was part of Rosenberg's work on self-esteem in the mid-1960s, but really was never articulated until later in the early 1980s. And it is an extension of self-esteem. It's this idea that others depend on us. I'm going to come back to this in a minute. So it's others really depend on us, but they regard us as important. So we are important in the lives of other people. And that people actually pay attention to us, right? And it's not sort of self-centered. It's simply that we know that people notice us, right? That they express that they are interested in what happens to us, and that we're recognized as important, and they depend on us. I'll come back to that. They later added this idea, the belief that we would be missed if no longer around. Now, this is really interesting too, because this concept, this statement itself, really leads to some of the work on mattering around suicide, right? This last idea, this idea that nobody would care if you weren't around, is one of the things that many people who attempt or actually complete suicide endorse, right? And so a lot of the suicide prevention work has really tried to focus on this idea of you matter, to try and encourage people to recognize that they in fact do matter. Subsequent to the work that Rosenberg and McCullough did, Elliott really came along and tried to operationalize this in a way that we could measure it. And that really says that these are the three constructs. There's awareness, there's importance, and then there's reliance. And so when we talk about mattering as a concept, first of all, it's a very powerful influence on motivation, right? People wish to matter. Some of the examples that people use in terms of this idea of wishing to matter really look to some of the negative outcomes. When people feel they don't matter, they may go to extremes to try and demonstrate that they do matter. This can be negative behavior seeking types of things, right? But people inherently do want to feel like they're important to other people, that they're recognized, and that they actually make a contribution. This is really one of the things about mattering. People who feel that they matter actually have a better time resisting maltreatment, right? Because it's this psychological sense that even though this may not be fair or this may not be right, I still know that there are people who matter to me. I'll give you a great example. So I've been a Fulbright Scholar 2 times in Eastern Europe. Both times I spent 3 months in a Serbian town, well, one in Serbia, one in Bosnia. I speak the language a little. I'm at best a 5-year-old, and I talk to 5-year-olds, and I'm not quite there, okay? In the towns I go, they're not in the major cities. Most people don't speak English. I have a really hard time. I can get by. I can understand what people say to me. I can't carry on a conversation, nothing like this. And I've gone alone. My family hasn't been able to join me except for most of the month. They had no idea what to do with me, right? I said, I'll do some lectures. I do a couple lectures. I do the lecture. I could disappear for a month and nobody would ever notice. And so the challenge was to stay connected and stay resilient, even when it really didn't matter if I was there or not. It was really challenging experience to spend 3 months in a place where you were completely unnecessary. And if it wasn't for the fact that I had this sense of mattering to other people, to other things, to the work I was doing, to my family back in the United States, it would have been really, really challenging. But it was difficult. It really was a difficult experience. One of the other things that's really interesting to us in terms of the work we're doing is that mattering can be modified and cultivated. And this is through the adding value component of mattering. This idea of reliance. Krylov-Tensky talks about, both being valued and adding value. Like if you don't add something to the environment, it undermines our feeling of mattering. Even if people care about us, if we really don't have a way to make a difference, make a contribution to be something. And we can do that. The concept is broadly relevant. People do recognize the idea of mattering, particularly anti-mattering. The idea that I'm invisible, I don't matter, nobody cares. So this is something that most people do find applicable. They understand it. Some of the focus has been on how mattering now. A lot of it's been on youth. right? A lot of the work on mattering has been on youth, and some of this comes out of some of the work that identified in some of the public health, the Healthy People initiatives. Why do you think that there's one of the indicators is youth with a significant adult relationship? Well, because it conveys a sense that they matter. And so the National Research Council really has identified this idea of focusing on engaging youth to encourage that they matter to adults. They matter to some adult in their life. But this concept is relevant throughout our lifespan, and increasingly also focused on in older adults. Again, when we lose some of those roles that used to be important roles in our lives, how do we continue to be connected, and how do we continue to matter to others? So one of the interesting things is a lot of the work on mattering has been published really in the last 2 years, simply because looking at how do people cope with this pandemic. And mattering is seen as one of those important psychological resources that allowed people to survive the pandemic with as little impact, as little negative impact as possible. Because we tend to still think about ourselves in positive ways, right? That we matter to other people. In fact, that's actually one of the things a lot of times we try and focus on, right? How do you help yourself? Well, help somebody else, right? Because that may be a way to make you feel better about yourself, feel more connected, and feel like you're in fact needed. And so this work on both Besser's work and Flett's work really looked at the impact of mattering through the pandemic. I think Flett said it really well, and this is what leads to some of the larger concepts of mattering. The person who feels like he or she matters is someone who is important, feels important, visible, and heard. While the person who feels like he or she does not matter to others feels unimportant, invisible, and unheard. The mattering that we're talking about is the mattering in Black Lives Matter, right? When people feel invisible, unimportant, and unheard, it's significant in its impact on people's well-being. And so this idea of mattering can be understood not only at the individual level, but at the community and national levels as well. Mattering is an important construct. So why does mattering matter? First of all, strongly connected with loneliness. It's not the same experience, but there is a strong overlap. Through mattering, we try and engage in relationships. Seeking to matter encourages us to reach out to others. It's also associated with recovery. For people with serious mental illness, feelings of mattering is a strong indicator of recovery from mental illness. And I think it's both connected because, again, going back to the idea of adding value is important in this situation. And then it seems to be an important predictor of meaning in life, stronger than some other psychosocial constructs, including belonging. Is there a downside to this? Can we matter too much? So this is one of the challenges. We're working on a project that will ideally start to try and engage people through volunteer activities to provide them an opportunity to engage in things that are of interest to them where they can make a difference. But there can be a downside to this. So with reliance, one of the key indicators of mattering comes obligation. Now, a lot of people see obligation as negative. I tend to see obligation as a positive thing. It can be negative. Like, one of the advantages of obligation is that it simplifies our decision-making process, right? How many of you got up today and decided, I've got 1,000 things to do, what will I do today? As opposed to saying, there's this talk, I'm gonna go to this talk, right? Obligations simplify our life in many ways. Pre-pandemic, most of us said, okay, I'm going to school, or okay, I'm going to work. That's what I do every day. When those obligations are taken away, it really disrupts people's lives. And this is one of the things we see in adults with serious mental illness. They're not needed anywhere at any time, going back to the Kurt Vonnegut quote. As a result, they fall into this inertia. But one of the things we have to look at is balancing these ideas of commitment and duty. And this is some of the work around volunteering. And commitment is the personal investment in a behavior or an activity. Duty is the obligatory sort of thing. And this is one of the challenges that we have, is that with reliance comes the possibility of letting people down. And this is really one of the challenges too, is that when people need us and rely on us, if we let them down, that may have a negative impact on us It may have a negative impact on our relationship, but it may make it harder for us to engage in those behaviors. And so we're really trying to look at how do we manage the level of obligation around this idea of reliance without making it overwhelming. In terms of the world itself, caregiver burnout, both personal caregivers and professional caregivers, think about being needed so much every day for so long. It takes its toll on people. And so mattering is important, but it is possible for it to be overbearing and overloading. And so this is really one of the challenges too that we see in this construct of mattering. So one of the things that happens a lot of times when I start talking about mattering is people mention belonging. Belonging is a very interesting social idea as well. Some have argued that we have a fundamental need to belong, that this is part of our evolution as human beings, and that even some argue that loneliness is actually a adaptive response to isolation and disconnection. That loneliness is the reaction when we become disconnected, and it pressures us to seek out reconnected, right? But this idea of belonging does strike somewhat of a difference between mattering, in that while both of them are based on social acceptance, belonging really has focused more along the lines of fit and this connection with larger symbolic entity. Baumeister and Leary, this is really one of the pivotal pieces in terms of belonging. They wrote a work in 1995 on need to belong. And they talk about it as this interpersonal bond marked by stability, effective concern, and continuation. And those are all very positive things. In fact, Prill-Otensky, and I've got some suggested reading for you. This particular work by Prill-Otensky I think is particularly good because it goes from the individual to the political level. But it recognizes the need to belong is a fundamental pillar of mattering. But what differentiates mattering from belonging is this idea of being needed and the ability to add value. So can we belong and still not matter? Most people who study mattering would say, yes, we can. In fact, one of the things that's really interesting in this whole literature area is the concept of belonging and mattering have been very important to college and university recruitment and retention initiatives. Initially focused on trying to help students in the transition to feel like they belong, but finding that even though they might feel like they belong with a university, if they are invisible, if they don't matter, if they don't have the connections, that the students will drop out and leave the universities. And so a lot of them have tried to switch to a mattering campaign, not just a you belong. And so this idea of mattering is really, I think, quite important in helping people to feel meaningfully connected, like other people need me. So the mattering construct itself is not unique to psychology. This work on the upper left, making sure you see what I see, is a book, a children's book called You Matter. The lower left, Every Child Matters, is an initiative in Canada. It's called the Orange Shirt Initiative, and it's to recognize the Indigenous children who were forced into residential schools in Canada and oftentimes stripped of their cultural identity. The bottom right is the You Matter campaign to try and connect people. And up in the top right is the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, that's message, never give up, you matter. And so the concept of mattering as a phenomenon is really very powerful. And many people recognize that the absence of this, the absence of mattering, has significant negative impacts on people's health and well-being. I'm going to open up for questions, but just for your interest, these are some of the key readings related to psychological constructs of mattering. As I mentioned, the one at the bottom by Prill-Otensky, Mattering at the Intersection of Psychology, Philosophy, and Politics, is really a very good read, very broad, talks about it from the individual level to the community level, and how there are communities and societies in which people feel that they matter, and there are communities and societies which foster feelings of not mattering, and the negative impacts of those things. You're welcome.
Questions, comments?
Can you touch a little bit upon more on the idea of mattering as broader social concept in from like the political
Yeah.
to the institutional.
Well, and
Especially, I was thinking about the messages, and you actually brought up Black Lives Matter,
Mhm.
but I was also thinking about things like recent like homicides of
Mhm.
Asian American women in spas, and
Right.
like how social reactions to certain things telling us they're not one thing or another,
Right.
as a particular population affects us. And if you've seen a difference in that in the United States, and if you've seen like in your readings, I'm sorry, it's very broad.
no, it's a broad question, but I genuinely appreciate it. And you know, the idea of mattering at the individual level, and that's most of where we're somewhat focused on, but it's also social, right? People with serious mental illness live in an environment that sets the stage for why they don't matter, right? That because they don't fit into a mold that other adults consistently fit into, they fall into this marginalization, right? And so how do we create societies in which many people, ideally all people, feel that they matter? And that's I think a bigger discussion. But the Asian American women, you know, working in the massage industries, clearly, if they mattered, things like this wouldn't happen, right? That their voice would have been heard, their position would have been recognized and valued, and they'd have an opportunity to contribute value, right? Not just people. And this is, I think, one of the more concerning parts to me about some of the approaches, like, and I don't mean to criticize this. I don't know how to go back. Just saying you matter doesn't do it, right? People have to have an opportunity to feel like not only they're heard and they can make a contribution, right? They're valued for what they contribute. And so that, I think, is one of the big challenges politically and socially. How do we change the social situation so that all people feel that they in fact do matter in meaningful ways, right? Not just a statement, you matter. You know, again, I'll go back to the difference between belonging and mattering. To say you matter is me saying, I recognize you and you're important to me, but it doesn't necessarily give you an opportunity to add value to the situation. Mm-hmm.
So I'm also wondering if you have any suggestions for readings on like these along those lines, and I think it's really important right now, especially since we're talking about what's happening in Ukraine a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I've heard several people talk about the cognitive dissonance between how we're reacting to Ukrainians defending the country versus Palestinians or other brown or global Black people
Mm-hmm.
defending their homes. Is there any, like, can you point to any research yet into how a sense of social belonging, politically and institutionally, relates to mattering and mental illness versus, so in the United States, for example, being a cishet WASP
Mm-hmm.
in New England, like how does that affect levels of mental illness, and is that like research being done yet?
In terms of the research being done, in terms of how we view different cultures and whether they matter to us or not, I don't know that research is being done at that level. I know that some of the theory, like Prilotensky, is actually one of the most interesting ones, I think, to really look at, because he really does talk about it at the much broader level. You know, he does identify at the individual level, but goes well beyond that to political level, and really talking about how societies are set up differently, collectivist versus individualist, and how some of those things do play a role in the relative degree in which all people matter or only some people matter. Again, this is a little beyond where we're working, but that's where I would begin to look for some indicators. Yeah, I don't see any questions in chat.
More so a question, but more of a comment on your concept, on the idea of belonging. I think that media plays a big role in that, because when you see certain people represented and certain people not represented, it may make people feel, oh well, this person doesn't look like me, or this this thing doesn't represent who I am, so I don't belong, which means that I don't matter. So I think that increasing diversity in all areas of media and society would help a lot, because a lot of people would find comfort when they feel like they belong to a certain group. And so some groups are more represented than others, which is why I feel like media has a very big impact.
Yeah. Well, and it's, you know, this idea of other people are aware of us. If I never see anybody like me in images that are presented to me, clearly you don't know that I even exist, right? And if you don't, if you're not aware of me, it's hard for me to matter if you don't even know I exist. There is, conceptually it can be measured. I mean, in terms of people's desire. And I think it goes back and forth. I mean, some people, the amount in which we are needed may vary from time to time, right? And there are ways of examining this. I mean, the talking about the concepts of duty and commitment is one of the ways, you know, because at what point does duty become burdensome, right? You know, we being needed and recognizing those obligations are important. I used to always talk about, I have two daughters, they're in their mid-30s at this point, but when they were younger, there were junior high choir recitals that I had to go to. And I did that out of duty. I did not do that because I loved junior high choir recitals. But if I had to do that often, it starts to become a little burdensome, right? But at the same time, it's always balancing sort of the need and the, you know, the reliance that I needed to be there for my daughters, right? So, you know, I think for each person, it varies from person to person, but it does have a tendency to become overwhelming. One of the concerns we have in working with adults with serious mental illness is that we don't want to set up people for failure, because failure is something that many of them have experienced multiple times, not just in terms of losing a job, losing a spouse or marriage, losing, you know, a family. It's an experience that's very, very challenging. And so, you know, trying to figure out ways to help people to feel like being needed is important, but the fact that you may not be able to do something, maybe you can't make a shift on time, sometimes that would stop people from ever coming back because they would be too embarrassed to come back. And so finding that balance for, you know, everybody needs some time sometime. You're okay, you know, you still are needed.
Following up on that, actually around the commitment and duty is fascinating, and thinking about its connection to whether someone perceives that they matter based on the nature of the relationship. So, and especially I'm struck with that slide you presented about how the structure of your networks changes. And I think that structure also changes as people get very elderly. And it also changes for people who have serious chronic health conditions, where you have more professional, more family members, and fewer discretionary friendship relationships. And I wonder about the kind of tensions that even creates in particularly family members, where the family member, you cares for the person genuinely and they matter to them, but the person who's the recipient of that care may perceive it as you're just doing this out of obligation, so it doesn't really make me feel like I matter.
Right.
So in thinking about interventions, like how important is it that we look at, say, those dynamics and communication versus grafting on these other kinds of discretionary relationships where people they just judge them differently. It's not like, well, you're here, you have no obligation to be here, you're not a family member, you're not paying to be here,
right?
So I must really matter to you.
Yeah. That's a really interesting question, and that dynamic that you just described is real characteristic also of the family members of adults with serious mental illness, right? That dynamic of, you know, do you really care about me? Do you really need me? Or are you just doing this out of obligation? You know, is definitely part of that dynamic. It's a really interesting question. You know, it's not, we're doing some work around families, but the idea of this being a qualitatively different type of volunteer activities or other external relationships, yeah, is an interesting question. I do see that we've got one question in the Q&A. It says, does social support and mattering for individuals, families dealing with SMI look differently for Latino, Latinx groups? Mental illness and health are culturally influenced. And so there's no question about it that these do have cultural differences. They do have different cultural norms. Different norms of reciprocity, different norms of family, you know, whether it's extended family, whether it's nuclear family, all of these things do definitely have a role in this area, and it does look different. It definitely does look different.
So I know if some people may have to go, but we'll take one more question.
Sure.
What are methods of non-instrumental care that wouldn't be like giving somebody?
Right. So non-instrumental care. So when I think of the easiest way to think of social support for me is this acronym that is easy for me to remember: aid, affect, and affirmation. Aid is the instrumental part, right? But affect is emotional support. Like when I'm down, people around me recognize I'm down and provide me emotional support, help me to regulate the emotion. There are other aspects of affect support. You know, they might try and cheer me up. So they're going to do other things to help support me in terms of my affective experience. Affirmation really is around us being able to reinforce each other's view of the world, not necessarily in that sort of way, but like, this is you had to be there. I see this way. Do you see this way? You're helping me to reaffirm sort of my view of the world, but also my identity and my place in it. And these types of things provide us support to feel like the world is a predictable place. And so those are the kinds of social support that that I think about, other than aid. But a lot of it is making sense of this world that can be nonsensical, right? I mean, the example I used frequently is September 11th. I swear I saw those planes hit the building 15 times. They played it over and over and over and over. But what did we do? We had to talk to each other about it. Objectively, we saw what happened, but we couldn't make sense of it. And so what we did was we turned to each other and say, what the heck was that? And that is part of social support that isn't the instrumental aspects of social support. There was one question in the chat, so I'll go ahead and take that one question. And Michelle said, do people who have strong feelings of inadequacy and that they don't matter tend to gravitate towards professionals in which other people will make them feel important or matter? There's always a challenge, I think, in terms of professional support. Again, not unlike the comment that Steve had made, is that professional support is in some ways unnatural. It is a supporter, but it isn't necessarily a natural connection. It's one that's there to help us. Now, that's not wrong. I mean, we have physicians in our lives to help us stay healthy or to combat disease. But again, the idea that do they gravitate towards professionals that will help them make them feel important or matter? I don't know if people would gravitate towards professionals in that way, but the difficulty is that relationship may not feel real. And here's why. In a professional relationship, the professional is there to help. So what is the opportunity for the individual to add value to that relationship, right? It's a one-way street. It's yet one more person helping the individual, with the individual having no opportunity to actually give back and make a difference. And that's why that kind of a relationship may not really enhance people's feelings of mattering. The issue of giving back is so critical to the concept of mattering. That's where, you know, that's why we feel like we matter. Thank you very much. I have feel free to contact me. I'm not going to show, but I've got 3 slides of references. So
Is there a class that you're teaching for people for next fall that some of these issues?
not yet, but it's a, I mean, it's a good point. And the project we're working on is a multi-year. You know, at the beginning, I mentioned that we're working on this project, and we're working on this project around social isolation and loneliness for the next